Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I've always been pretty transparent on this channel about the fact that studio photography, studio lighting was something that I struggled with for a really long time. It wasn't something that came naturally to me, and it was something that I had to put a lot of effort in to learn. And this was for a number of reasons. One was that I'd never had anyone show me how to do studio lighting. The second one was there is, of course, a barrier to entry that is higher for studio photography than there is for location-based photography. I didn't feel like the examples of studio lighting on the internet, on places like YouTube, were representative of the type of work that I wanted to be creating. So I really had to learn the slow and expensive way about studio photography. I had to rent out studios and kind of just learn on the job where I could. And as I've been learning about studio photography, I've tried my best to share that journey on this channel. You know, if you go back right to my early videos, then you'll see me shooting in the studio like completely just with natural light because that's all I felt comfortable with, or shooting with studio lighting setups that just were flat and didn't make sense, and I didn't really know how to adapt them, and I didn't know how to modify them, and I didn't know how to translate my vision into the technical aspects of studio photography that I needed to. And in today's video, I'm going to be sharing one of the lighting techniques that I use probably most regularly and the different ways in which I adapt it. Because I think that's the key to studio photography, is to having a good understanding of a few set basics, a few things within your arsenal that you can just quickly put together, and then knowing what you can do to alter that and modify it depending on the circumstance. From my experience at least, I've found that that's the least daunting way to approach studio photography. You know, when you walk into a studio, maybe you're in there with a client already and you want to look prepared, you want to look like you know what you're doing. And I find that if you just know like one or two lighting setups that you know that you can just quickly put together, put up and start shooting, and then you can kind of work from there and adapting it and making sure that it fits the vision, then it takes out some of that anxiety, I guess, about being in the studio, about making it look like you know what you're doing, and all of those things that kind of come with something as technical as studio photography. So let's get stuck in. So this is a technique that I use really regularly in the studio, and it's a lighting setup that is quick and easy to set up and even easier to adapt and manipulate. It's a go-to for me as a starting point in most studio sessions, especially when I want to get started shooting quickly, don't want to waste time setting up at the beginning. I'll start with this lighting, and like I said, I'll just adapt it from there. You can use this setup with both strobes and constant light, so it's really up to you with what you're comfortable with. Later on in this video, I'm going to go through kind of pros and cons of doing it with both. So the main element of this setup is utilising an overhead light as your key light instead of your hair light. So using overhead lighting often is referred to as hair light because it lights the top of your hair, creates that kind of like separation between the background and the subject, the model. But I like to use this as the key light, and the key light meaning the most prominent light and sometimes the only light. And then I will introduce other lights depending on what it is that I'm working with, or maybe I won't introduce any other lights, but I'll introduce different levels of fill or negative fill. So usually what I'll do is I set up a light with a large softbox. The size of the softbox is of course going to affect the spread of the light and the diffusion, how diffuse this light is. But usually I use a pretty big softbox and I rig it overhead using most often a C-stand with a boom arm. Most studios that you walk into will likely have a boom arm on a C-stand. So the considerations here are making sure that you extend it far enough over so that it's above your model, because your position of the light is really going to affect where shadows fall, especially because it is overhead, it's, you know, it's casting shadows on your model's face. But also you need to make sure that you're balancing it. So use a sandbag or something, or a couple of sandbags on the other end of the boom arm just to make sure that it doesn't fall over, tip over. You can use this technique on any kind of backdrop, whether that's a cove or a colorama or something like that. I personally prefer using it on a cove because you can just move your model a little bit further forward and create that depth and a bigger separation between your model and the backdrop. It's just easier in my opinion. If you don't have a boom arm to hand, you can adapt to this by kind of putting a normal C-stand, put the light on the C-stand, take it as high as you can get it to go, and then kind of tilt the light down towards your model. Sometimes I have to do this anyway if the boom arm can't extend that far, then I'm just gonna kind of angle the light so that it's hitting the model's head where I kind of want it to. But when it comes to modification, this is where it's really important. So we have this overhead light as our key light, as our base, and then we're going to add things in to kind of adapt it and customize it so that it isn't the same look every time. So often I'll introduce a second light and we'll use this as a fill light, which essentially does what it says on the tin. It's going to fill in those shadows. If you don't have a second light, you can also use something like a V-flat, a polyboard, any kind of reflective surface. Because your light is overhead, it's going to be really easy to reflect light back into your image. A little bit more like when you're shooting on location and you're reflecting the sun into your image. That's pretty easy because the sun is, you know, above and up in the sky, and it's easy to kind of reflect that light. And with an overhead light, it's very much the same kind of idea. Another one of my favorite ways to use this setup is to use my second light and point it at the backdrop. So whether this is the cove or something, and flood it with colored light. So you can do this with strobes with a gel, or you can use an RGB light, like a constant light, and flood the background with some sort of color. So then you have a colored backdrop without having to use coloramas, and your overhead light is still your key light, and that is illuminating your subject. So what are the upsides of using an overhead light as your key light? My first one would be that it is a really quick and simple way to create drama in your image. It's creating, you know, more directional light than just a softbox like how I have here, just kind of facing me, and it's pretty flat. It's not really doing much. It's not creating many shadows. It's not creating much kind of direction. But on the topic of shadows, I also think that this is a really good way to manage your shadows. So whilst you'll have shadows on your model's face and stuff like that, because the light's coming downwards, that can be managed with like reflectors. That for me is a lot easier if I've only got one light than trying to balance shadows that are on the cove from pointing the light directly at you. Because usually you're going to have an extra light or two pointed at the backdrop to balance that out. This eliminates that because the shadows are going to be down at the model's feet, like underneath them, rather than behind them. But what are the cons? What are the downsides of using this kind of lighting setup? Firstly, rigging a light so high up can come with its own challenges, especially when you want to alter the look or change things up. It's not a massive issue, but it does add, you know, a few extra minutes onto lighting changes. The shadows on the faces can also be quite dramatic, and it might not suit every model's face or, you know, every face shape or face structure. So this is where using fill lights, using reflectors to kind of even out those shadows can be really useful. So should you use strobes or should you use a constant light, and is there much of a difference? So when you're working with this kind of lighting setup, there are a few considerations when it comes to what type of light you want to use. Strobe lights are a great option. If you want to freeze your subject in action, you can utilize a lot more power when you're using a flash, which can help if you're shooting with film and like a predetermined ISO. But when it comes to shooting with a constant light, one of the big selling points is that you can see the lighting in real time. So as you change it, you can see very quickly what you're doing and how that is affecting your image, which makes it a lot easier to adapt, a lot easier to modify, and a lot easier to learn. But one of the downsides of constant light is that you are kind of sacrificing power. They're not quite as bright. And obviously if you're rigging a light really high up and it's far away from your model, that light might not reach if you don't have a powerful enough light. But also constant light usually gives you more options when it comes to like RGB and stuff like that. So there is like more customization in that kind of scope as well. This is a great time to say thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, offering a wide depth and breadth of topics from illustration, graphic design, music, and of course photography. It utilizes a learn by doing approach to teaching, where you are encouraged to share your projects, get feedback. You can even use Skillshare's learning paths, which are curated, sequential series of videos that help you master a specific skill. I've been working with Skillshare for quite a number of years now to create my own classes on photography, from the business of photography, developing your portfolio, to more technical skills like color theory and things like lighting. All of my classes can be enjoyed alongside classes from hundreds of other creators, all included in one subscription. And my brand new class is all about studio photography. So whether you've dabbled in the studio before and you're looking to improve your skills or pick up some easy lighting techniques, just like the one that we're talking about in today's video, or you know, you've never stepped inside a studio before and you're looking for an overview of everything from how to attach a modifier to understanding the different types of lighting. My new class covers that. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about studio photography, or maybe touching on color theory and other technical aspects of photography, or even learning something completely new and completely unrelated, click the link in the description to get set up with Skillshare. The first 500 people to use the link in the description will get a free 1-month trial of Skillshare. So head over and get stuck in. I'm going to now run through a variety of different photos taken using this lighting setup, where my key light has been this overhead light. Starting with some photos where the only light on is the overhead light. You can see here where just the overhead light is on, how dramatic the shadows can be. It instantly elevates from a flat studio image to something with a little bit more depth. Adding a second light as either a fill light or a background color, you can see how easily you can begin to adapt the setup really simply. Studio photography can really be daunting at first, but when you realize how having a couple of different key lighting setups under your belt can take that pressure off of you, it gives you the space to be able to experiment and to be able to learn as you do so. I think that's all that studio photography is about. It's about experimenting, testing things, trying things, taking one thing that has worked for you in the past and expanding on that, adding to it, subtracting from it, changing it. And that's what I really encourage you guys to do today, is to take maybe not even this lighting setup, maybe you found another lighting setup that you really like the look of, and take that and just experiment, alter it, change it, and see what you can do and how that can enhance your photos. But I really hope you guys have enjoyed today's video. A reminder that the first 500 people to use the link in the description will get a free 1-month trial to Skillshare, where you can access my full class all about studio photography. I will see you guys in the next one.